So our closing keynote this afternoon is Secretary Anthony Foxx of the U.S. Department of Transportation, and he became the 17th United States Secretary of Transportation in July 2013. And before he speaks, he's actually asked us to show a brief video that he's provided us with. So it's a very short video, and then we'll have him speak.
My childhood neighborhood had one road in and the same road out. It was bordered by two highways. That infrastructure sent a signal to me about my life.
The highway to nowhere displaced 10,000 or more families, and it disrupted a community.
The connectivity of the smaller community was more intact before the red line came through.
We live here, we love this place, we work to honor this place. We didn't create the conditions that exist in West Baltimore. The citizens didn't create that.
I see transportation as three things. One, it does get us places. Transportation also improves places, so that's an important function. And then the other thing I think transportation does is it knits us together. It's one of the things we as a society do together, and we can't do it by ourselves. This is a community function, and if it doesn't work for the entire community, the transportation system doesn't work. That's the story of America's infrastructure that we don't tell as much.
Transportation historically has created barriers in the last 60 years. What's remarkable today is that transportation policy is saying, let's create things that bring people together.
It's very important that the community have a say, and I think it's very important that we tell the right story.
Transportation infrastructure can definitely be beneficial to a community. Make sure that your process to engage a community has a level of integrity to it.
The challenge of the 21st century is how you take what we have and make it an inclusive incarnation of the future. And that's what we're trying to do here at DOT.
So at the U.S. Department of Transportation, Secretary Foxx leads an agency with over 55,000 employees, budget exceeding $70 billion. The DOT oversees air, maritime, and surface transportation, and the Secretary's primary goal is to ensure that America maintains the safest, most efficient transportation system in the world for this and future generations. Please join me in welcoming Secretary Foxx.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. It's good to be up here in Columbia. In a former life, I was a graduate of New York University Law School, so I'm getting there. I'm getting there. It's good to be here, though. I'm going to talk briefly about smart cities and the concept of equity as it relates to this concept of smart cities. And I'm going to try to do this within 10 minutes because we're a little pushed for time, and then save some time for Q&A with Professor Usher. Let me begin by saying that there's a lot of stuff in the literature about smart cities, and I will define it as we typically do today, as a city that puts in something cool that has a technological component to it. That's our current definition of a smart city. But the truth of the matter is, I think there is much more to this concept than the technology. What's really important about cities in general, and about transportation systems within cities in particular, is how does the community's purposes get served by the infrastructure we put in, be it technological infrastructure or hard infrastructure like asphalt, concrete, and steel. And the reason why I think it's important for us to talk about smart cities today is because we are going through a series of revolutions that will impact every single person, not only here, but potentially around the globe. Let me quickly define those. Number one, population changes. We're going to grow this country by 70 million people over the next 30 years. Many of those people are going to want to live in cities. This is very different than the last 40 years. Back in the middle 1970s, our population was leaving cities and moving into suburban and rural areas. We're having the opposite trend today. Not only that, it is who are these people? The two largest demographics in our country today are the baby boomers and the millennials. Millennials have just overtaken the boomers. And if you think about it, the millennials have a different idea of how the transportation system relates to them. When I was 16, I wanted to get a driver's license and buy a car. A millennial may get a driver's license, but they're more interested in buying a ride. And there's a big difference. Big difference. Both millennials and boomers tend to want to live closer in, take advantage of restaurants and concerts and walk and bicycle to places. This is an element of the pressure that we're facing in transportation, and we have to think about it from a demand side standpoint, not a supply side standpoint. I'll talk about that more later. Two, how things get to us is changing. So over the next 30 years, 65% more trucks on the road, 45% more freight volume, the new Panama Canal, post-Panamax vessels, deeper ports on the East Coast, the need to upfit our infrastructure on the interior to meet those needs for double-stack containers and other things. Three, climate. It's raining today. The other day, Washington, D.C. had flash flooding. A couple of years ago, you had Superstorm Sandy. A few more years ago, Hurricane Katrina. How weather impacts our infrastructure is something we've been thinking quite a bit about in the Obama administration. We've been working hard to build our infrastructure at a higher level of resiliency. And we're taking lessons learned from New Orleans and Katrina and the Gulf Coast and up here in the Northeast Corridor and incorporating that into how we build. Fourth, technology. Technology is changing everything. It's now coming into transportation with a awesome force. Whether it's driverless cars, or drones, or intelligent transportation systems, or next-gen navigation, technology is going to change the way we move. And I've seen the future myself. And that's going to have an impact on cities. So all of this, all these trends mean that we have to think differently. Oh, and by the way, the fifth, we don't have enough money to pay for the infrastructure we need. Right? And so if you're not going to fully fund the transportation system, then you're going to need to be smart about what you invest in. So how would you ever know? Well, maybe in the 21st century, we will actually let the data tell us what we need to do. We'll let the changing tastes of our population tell us what we need to do. And we'll find effective ways to incorporate smart thinking into the way we build our infrastructure. I would like to point out one other thing, which is that we are facing one of the largest trends of income differentiation of a society on this planet. And in fact, if you've had a chance to read a wonderful book by Robert Caro called The Power Broker, you can see examples of how the infrastructure has impacted this city and created more lines of separation in the physical construction of our transportation system. The Bronx-Queens Expressway being one example. The question of the 21st century when it comes to how we build our infrastructure isn't just can we meet the demand, it's not just can we move stuff, it's not just can we make it more resilient, it's not just can we find the best technological solutions and the data and analytics to back it up, it is also can we use our infrastructure decisions to help us close the income gap that we have in this country. Can we create catalytic investments that transform neighborhoods that today don't have a pharmacy or a grocery store and create the kind of economic imperative for those areas to be transformed and the people who live there to be able to stay and have a future? To me, that's what a smart city is. Figures these things out. And by the way, there are going to be no two cities that are the same in terms of being smart. There are going to be different needs in different places. So that's in a nutshell what I had to say. There's probably a lot more behind it, but I think Professor Usher will help tease it out of me, and if he doesn't, I'm sure you will. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Perfect. Please, let's see.
Either side.
Thank you, Secretary Foxx.
Thank you.
So let's start with the big picture.
Sure.
Transportation challenges. What do you see as the big transportation challenges faced by cities?
I think the biggest challenge cities face is they've been at a point of stasis for so long because there was such a period of time that the Congress hadn't passed a long-term transportation bill. Some states had jumped out there, but the infrastructure deficit has hit cities particularly hard. And while they have plans, many of them are taking the smallest parts of the plans and advancing those and really putting a lot of their money into maintenance as opposed to new capacity. So I think the belief deficit has gotten much bigger even than the infrastructure deficit. And what our cities need today is a much greater imagination about how infrastructure can reshape the landscape and meet the needs of its people. And that's one of the things I talk about a lot is thinking much bigger than we've been thinking for the last decade or two.
Right. Well, speaking of the belief deficit, let's move on from the big picture to just one of the issues that I know you focus on, inequality.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned in a presentation you gave earlier this year in Charlotte,
Yeah.
you talked about the fact that in low-income areas, 49% of those areas have sidewalks.
Mm-hmm.
And in affluent communities, 90% have sidewalks.
Yeah.
And yet transportation, sidewalks, these are the channels to economic progress. Mm-hmm. We need transportation to have economic success. So what do we do about that? How do we deal with that?
Yeah, look, I think we've got a huge problem. And frankly, a lot of those sidewalk, crosswalk decisions are made at the local level. It's not even just the federal government. And so this is an example of where every level of government has to really be intentional about trying to smooth out these rough spots and these disparities. I think probably the biggest unexamined issue is the extent to which transportation can catalyze growth in areas. And I'll give you an example. We have a light rail project that's happening in Los Angeles right now. It's happening in Crenshaw, Los Angeles. And Los Angeles, the city, is taking advantage of a local hire pilot that we have. So the project's not just happening in Crenshaw. The contractor can actually hire people who live in Crenshaw to work on the project, and it is a resounding success. But Los Angeles wanted to do that project not just to create a throughput through Crenshaw. They wanted to help reinvent Crenshaw. And now you're getting live workspaces. You're getting the pharmacy and the grocery store. Jobs are coming into an area that historically had been underserved. And that is a tool that we have not used as effectively in this country to advance mobility.
And when you look at those tools and the options you have, and there's many in the transport area, do you see a difference in opinion on these solutions among socioeconomic divide? Is there a difference there? What is that?
Well, I think, just take sidewalks again. We had some of our most fierce battles in local government over sidewalks because the money just isn't there to do all of the ones that you want to do. And those who are not at the table end up being on the menu, and usually those are lower income folks. So that's one issue right there. I think also when you're talking about a period of scarcity of transportation dollars, if you spend the dollars doing the Crenshaw line, invariably someone else is going to say, well, hold on, wait a second. There are many more people who live over here. There's much more economic activity over here. Why would you build a line to nowhere? And I've heard that time after time on some of the more controversial projects around the country. And of course the reason is because that nowhere is actually somewhere, and you actually have a responsibility to ensure that every part of a city is healthy. And sometimes you have to make investments in transportation to do that.
Yeah. Speaking of somewhere, you launched a program called Ladders of Opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
You pilot in 7 cities.
Mm-hmm.
Just to get those right, it's Indiana, Atlanta, Baltimore, Charlotte, Richmond, Phoenix, and Baton Rouge.
Yeah.
Why those cities? Tell us a bit about the pilot and an example of what you're doing.
Yeah.
What's happening?
So we took some work that had been done by a variety of economists and social scientists on the ability of poor folks in cities across the country to achieve a middle-class lifestyle. Mm-hmm. And we took the bottom 50 cities and we started figuring out where we felt like we had good leadership in local government to advance mobility using transportation. So we picked those 7 cities, and we said to the mayors of those cities, is there a transportation project that's on your wish list that you think would make a dent in the ability of someone who's poor to be able to achieve middle-class lifestyle? So the mayor of Indianapolis says, hey, I've got a bus rapid transit project that I think would work for us. In Baton Rouge, it's a streetcar project, and the same is true in Charlotte. In Richmond, there's a bus rapid transit project. They're all different, but they have in their minds how these projects can make a difference. So we've spent 2 years doing technical assistance, and those projects are slowly coming online. And they're not just coming online with DOT's help. We've put wraparound support from the Housing and Urban Development, from the EPA and other agencies to ensure that the aftercare of those projects is going to be good so the communities can be stronger.
Terrific. Change the subject.
Sure.
Technology. You
Yes.
mentioned technology in your comments. Clearly topics of great interest at the moment, driverless technology in particular. And look, just last month, Uber launched their pilot in Pittsburgh. Sure. And you said you've seen the future.
Yeah.
How's that future look? When do driverless cars become the majority of vehicles on the road? What does that look like?
Wow. Look, I think we're going to see driverless cars in the marketplace really soon. I mean, I'd easily say within the next 3 to 5 years. And it's going to be interesting to see how much of it is led by consumer preferences. In other words, you and me buying these cars versus ride-sharing services, buying cars directly from automakers, and then folks making use of them through ride-share services, versus transit agencies making use of these vehicles. There's also going to be a very significant trucking industry that's going to emerge using driverless trucks. And, you know, look, let's face it, we have 94% of our crashes today are attributable to human error. Not wearing a seatbelt, drunk driving, distracted driving, just plain old mistakes that people make. And if we have technology that can wrest some of that control away from us and improve on the decision making, we think we can save a lot of lives in the process.
Yeah. Yeah. And is there well, there is a connection clearly between technology and driverless cars and inequality. The other subjects talked about it, but it could be a positive connection, it could be a negative connection in terms of jobs.
Yeah.
How do you think about that?
So
challenge.
Labor market disruption is one of those issues that we are thinking about. And I haven't announced it yet, so if you'll keep it just between us, I'm planning to create a forum for what I would call next stage conversations about autonomy. to include issues like ethics, labor market disruption, privacy, cybersecurity issues. There are a whole number of things that need to be talked about and thought about. We're going to create a forum for that in DOT, for that conversation to continue in perpetuity. But you know, I don't know. It's a tough one.
How do you, with these tough decisions, there's how many cities there are in this country, but there's a tremendous number. How do you prioritize among different cities?
Well, you know, we had this challenge this year with the Smart City Challenge. We put $40 million of US DOT money on the table. We asked medium-sized cities across the country if they would compete for it, and we got 78 applications. And we were able to winnow that group down to 7, and then down to 1. Columbus, Ohio won the competition. We did the competition actually because we wanted cities, not just the one that won, but all cities to think about how they can use innovation and technology to advance the cause of their communities. And now we have 78 templates out there, and they are all different. So the work that we have ahead is figuring out ways we can use department resources to help those cities build on top of those plans. And you know, we love all of our cities. We can't always do everything we want to do for each of them, but we try to do what we can for all of them.
Sitting here in New York City, we sometimes forget we're not the center of the universe. Does a lot of the innovation come from the medium-sized and smaller cities? You see a lot of transport innovation?
You can. You know, our thought process for the Smart City Challenge was those cities are big enough to have scalable problems, and they're also small enough to have scalable solutions. So that was our thought process. You know, sometimes you come to a place like New York and you try to come up with a solution to something, and it might be useful in Chicago or Los Angeles, but not necessarily in middle America, so to speak. But we do think we'll learn things during this Smart City Challenge that New York can use and Chicago can use. It might work the other way, but it doesn't work in reverse.
That would be terrific. That'd be great. And partnerships. How do you leverage partnerships? You get the federal government is obviously has impressive capabilities, but state, municipal governments, and private sector.
Yeah.
How do you leverage partnerships, especially coming back to the issue of inequality, economic segregation?
Yeah, I think so. This is a very important question, and I think from a social equity standpoint, we all need to be very skeptical of our transportation system. I don't mean suspicious in a negative way. I just mean we shouldn't assume that the processes we use to develop our transportation plans is a process that's going to yield the most equitable outcome. We have to keep working on that. And I'll give you one example. I was in Copenhagen a few months ago talking to Gale architects about some work they do around the world. And they were explaining a unique idea around public engagement and public input in the planning process. So today, if I were the mayor of Miles City, I'd go to a meeting at the government center at 5 o'clock to talk about a transportation project. And if you wanted to be part of that, you would come to the meeting. And if you didn't come to the meeting, your input wouldn't be counted. Well, they have this idea of public engagement that says, let's go out to where people are going already. You know, whether it's a concert or a coffee house or a library or wherever. Let's not use our language as transportation planners. Let's use their language to talk to them about whatever the project happens to be, and let's fold that input into what happens. And so it's very much a user-friendly way of thinking about public engagement. Now, that's kind of radical for us because we know how to do the meeting at the government center.
Right.
We don't necessarily know how to do that meeting at the coffee house. But I think that's the type of tool we need to be thinking about so that we can get better outcomes and, frankly, better input into how projects happen.
And speaking of radical outcomes, you mentioned Copenhagen. Are there other cities globally, either in Europe or other developed countries or in emerging countries, where you've seen some really interesting innovations that would be applicable in the U.S.?
I think I could draw different things from different places. You know, it's interesting to me that when I go to Europe, I'm still looking for a city in Europe that has these inner loops that are right around their downtowns. Most of them have preserved their interiors without highways. You can get to those cities using highways, but once you're there, you're using the street grid. And there's a quaintness about that I think is good. It doesn't interrupt the community's rhythm. I'd also say that you go to Amsterdam and it's hard not to notice the bicycling and the way that folks have integrated bicycling into the life of that city. Frankly, New York is a great example of what I think is not only the functional purpose of transportation with your subway system, but the social function of it. When you go into your subway system, you have everybody from Michael Bloomberg to a homeless guy, you know, and the reality is that even if you're not talking to everybody that's on that subway, you're there, and you're part of something larger than yourself. Where I'm from, you get in your car, and you are the king or queen of the road, and that mindset stays with you when you start thinking about your politics, and you start thinking about who you hang around, and you start thinking about all kinds of things. And I think part of what transportation can give us are these points of access to each other, if we let it. And that's very much something I think the American public need more of.
So, looking ahead for the American public, yes. You mentioned the boomer generation. That actually happens to be my generation. Has been overtaken by the millennials, and I say that's great. That's great. And you also talked about the fact, yeah. Well,
you don't sound bitter.
No, it's all theirs. They're looking for car shares. We were looking for cars, and they're looking for car shares. So, where does that go in the future? How do our cities change? How does our roads change? Driverless technology. Are they all going to be driving bikes and driverless, or, you know, this is more of a younger phenomena, and as people age?
Yeah, I think in the future it should be a real option for someone not to have to own a car. Now, if someone wants to own a car, have at it. But we ought to have particularly our urban environments set up so that folks have a range of choices. I can walk to the grocery store. I can bike to my job. I can walk to the local park or what have you. And we've kind of gotten out of that in many cities across the country, but I think that's increasingly what millennials are telling us they need and they want. Technology can help with that. Certainly, ride-sharing services can be part of that ecosystem. I tend to think that you're going to see with autonomous vehicles people having accounts with these different companies, and the cars are going to be staged someplace, and you call the car comes and gets you if you need to take a long trip. Otherwise, you can just choose to hang around the area where you are. I think land use is an underappreciated connector of transportation, and so the smarter we are with our land use policies, the more we can leverage existing infrastructure and not have to build so much new stuff.
Right, right. We only have time for one more question.
Okay.
One last one.
That'll be a good one.
It's a good one, I hope, for the audience, because we have a lot. You know, we have students. We have a number of people who are thinking about their careers.
Yeah.
And transportation as a field is a field that I think it's fair to say is being disrupted for all the reasons you talked about. You know, if I were a millennial, the millennials in the audience, what would you say about careers? What advice would you give in terms of where is this sector going? Where would you be thinking about from a career perspective?
You know what? It's interesting. I think this is going to be a longer answer, but
good.
You know, I was thinking about when I was a kid and VCRs came out. Now, you know,
you're not a millennial.
I'm not a millennial. Y'all don't even know what a VCR is. Don't worry about it. It's not important.
It's gone.
But they were like $1,000. And then, you know, over time it got down to 500, then 250. And by the time they kind of phased out, they were down to like less than $100. And what that told me about how technology typically comes to us is that it starts out at a huge price point, and those who can afford it get access to it first. And then slowly it sort of levels out. The interesting thing about transportation is that I actually see it starting out more flat, because there's such a strong connection between what the public purse and public policy does to create the platform for transportation to happen and the technology that's coming around, that I think particularly in cities, mayors are going to insist that cool technology be accessible to everybody. Right. So with our Smart City Challenge, we actually had a part of our proposal that focused on this question, and we got proposals that put neighborhood kiosks in place so that people who don't have mobile phones have access to the applications that were going to be brought about, that cities were thinking about how to give people access to those applications even if they didn't have a debit card or a credit card. And I think, you know, if you're in the business side of this stuff, I'd be thinking much more flat about how to create points of access, because a lot of the customers for this stuff are going to be cities and states, and those places aren't going to want exclusionary products. They're going to want products that can be accessible to everybody. So I think there's going to be fun stuff to do in the private markets. I think there's going to be fun stuff to do in the public sector, and I think cities are going to be one of the most exciting places to be.
It's a great note to close on. Please join me in thanking Secretary Foxx.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
That was
delightful. I really enjoyed that. Yeah.
Conference. Over to you.
So on behalf of my conference co-chair, Hillary Wool, and all of the Columbia students who've helped make this conference possible, we thank you for electing to spend your day with us, asking thoughtful questions, engaging in lunchtime dialogues, and bringing your passion, perspectives, and candor to the forefront as we collectively consider how to transform our cities to make them more equitable, sustainable, innovative, and inclusive. Throughout the day, we've heard from business leaders, social entrepreneurs, policy experts, and even a member of President Obama's cabinet. They're people who dedicate each day to making our cities work for all of us. We hope that you've found one, if not many, guiding themes for how you will embark on shaping this city and other cities around the world, starting in 2 minutes, because we couldn't let everyone leave this conference hall without properly thanking the Tamer Center for Social Enterprise team, who played the most significant role in making all aspects of today possible. Some faces are familiar to you. Damon Phillips and Bruce Usher are amazing faculty members and co-directors of the Tamer Center. Sandra Navali, Senior Director of the Tamer Center, Diana Rambeau and Hannah Slow, Associate Director of Events and Community Engagement and Assistant Director of Communications, respectively, and the rest of the Tamer team. Their vision has been the connective thread for all elements of today's conference. They're a leading reason why the Social Enterprise Program is expanding each year, and why the Social Enterprise Club is one of the most popular and fastest growing clubs on campus. Fellow students, we encourage you to check out some of the campus events coming up this fall. From an impact hackathon focused on tackling urban development issues in New York City, to a social impact real estate panel, and so much more. We're appreciative of Chris, Natasha, and Joanne, who will be hard at work starting tomorrow, planning next year's Social Enterprise Conference. Thank you for joining us on campus today, and we look forward to collaborating again with you in the future.